There is a moment that arrives quietly, no warning, no dramatic sound, just silence where certainty used to live. Consistency is one of the most misunderstood forces in human attraction. When a man shows up repeatedly, on time, emotionally available, mentally present, the brain begins to categorize him as safe. Safety feels calming, but it also feels predictable. And the human mind has a dangerous habit of confusing predictability with permanence. What was once impressive slowly becomes expected. Not because the effort stopped mattering, but because the effort stopped feeling optional. At the beginning, consistency feels like proof. Every call answered, every promise kept, every moment of emotional steadiness signals commitment. She notices it then. She talks about it. She feels chosen. But over time, the mind adapts. This adaptation is psychological, not intentional. The brain conserves energy by no longer reacting strongly to what repeats without variation. Just like background music fades from awareness, emotional reliability fades from conscious appreciation. This is where misinterpretation begins. Consistency is mistaken for something fixed, like gravity or daylight, rather than something actively chosen. She no longer sees each act as a decision he makes daily. Instead, she sees it as part of who he is, and therefore something that cannot disappear. The idea that he could stop choosing her feels unrealistic, almost impossible. And when something feels impossible to lose, the urgency to protect it weakens. Meanwhile, inconsistency elsewhere starts to feel exciting. Emotional unpredictability triggers alertness. It creates contrast. When someone is unreliable, every small effort feels amplified. A delayed text suddenly carries weight. A rare compliment feels powerful. The nervous system mistakes intensity for value. Compared to that emotional spike, consistency feels flat, even though it's the foundation of real connection. The man who is steady doesn't create anxiety, and because he doesn't create anxiety, his presence doesn't activate survival instincts. There's no chase, no fear of abandonment, no emotional tension. Instead of being recognized as maturity, this calm is subconsciously interpreted as a lack of depth or desire. She assumes he doesn't need reassurance because he never asks for it. She assumes he's fine because he doesn't protest. His emotional regulation becomes invisible labor. Over time, small dismissals creep in, conversations are postponed, effort is uneven, appreciation becomes internal rather than expressed. Not out of malice, but out of assumption. She believes he understands without explanation, forgives without apology, and stays without reinforcement. His silence in moments of neglect is misread as tolerance rather than restraint, but consistency does not mean immunity to exhaustion. Every act of patience costs something. Every unacknowledged effort accumulates weight. The man absorbs more than he expresses, believing that stability requires endurance. Yet even the strongest structure weakens when pressure is applied repeatedly without release. The critical misunderstanding is this: consistency is not permanence, it is discipline. It is a daily recommitment. And discipline, when unrecognized, eventually turns into withdrawal, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. When giving becomes a one-sided identity instead of a shared exchange, the giver begins to step back internally long before anyone notices externally. The shift is subtle. He becomes quieter, less expressive, less eager to initiate. And because she has learned to associate him with reliability, these changes don't trigger immediate alarm. She assumes it's temporary. She assumes he will return to the way he was. After all, he always has. But that assumption is exactly what allowed the distance to grow. Comfort is one of the most deceptive emotional states a relationship can reach. It feels warm, stable, familiar. But beneath that familiarity, something subtle begins to erode. Appreciation doesn't disappear. Suddenly, it softens, quiets, and eventually becomes internal rather than expressed. And when appreciation is no longer communicated, comfort quietly replaces it as the dominant emotional tone. In the early stages, effort is visible. Every gesture is noticed because it feels intentional. Time feels valuable because it feels limited. Attention feels meaningful because it feels earned. But as comfort grows, the mind stops scanning for proof of care. The relationship no longer feels like something that needs to be maintained. It feels like something that simply exists. And when something simply exists, the instinct to actively value it weakens. Comfort creates the illusion of understanding. She believes he already knows how much she values him, so saying it feels unnecessary. Gratitude becomes assumed rather than spoken. Compliments feel repetitive, affection feels routine, and acknowledgement feels optional. The emotional exchange shifts from showing appreciation to feeling appreciation silently. But silent appreciation has no weight to the receiver. It nourishes the one who feels it, not the one who needs to experience it. At the same time, comfort reduces emotional urgency. There's no fear of loss, no pressure to impress, no anxiety about being replaced. While this can be healthy, it can also dull awareness. She stops noticing the effort because the effort no longer stands out. He becomes part of the emotional furniture, present, reliable, and unconsciously taken for granted. His consistency blends into the environment instead of registering as a continuous gift. This is where imbalance begins to form. Effort that once felt mutual starts flowing more heavily in one direction. He continues showing up in the same ways because that's who he is, not because he's being rewarded for it. Meanwhile, her expressions of appreciation become less frequent, less specific, less intentional. Not because she feels less, but because she assumes less is required. The danger of comfort is that it disguises neglect as normalcy. Missed check-ins don't feel alarming. Emotional distance doesn't feel urgent. Small dismissals are brushed aside because the relationship feels secure overall. She believes stability can absorb small losses without consequence. What she doesn't see is that these small moments accumulate quietly in the other person. The man receiving comfort without appreciation begins to question his emotional significance. Not his role, but his value. He feels needed but not cherished, expected but not chosen. And when a man feels useful rather than desired, something inside him begins to retract. He doesn't confront it immediately because comfort teaches him patience. But patience without reassurance slowly turns into emotional self-protection. Comfort also changes perception. What once felt like effort now feels like obligation. His presence feels assumed. His patience feels unlimited. His understanding feels automatic. She doesn't realize that comfort has shifted her perspective from gratitude to entitlement. Not consciously, but psychologically, the relationship moves from appreciation based to expectation based. And expectations are silent demands. They don't celebrate, they consume. When appreciation fades, the emotional feedback loop breaks. He gives, but doesn't feel received. He stays, but doesn't feel seen. He listens, but doesn't feel acknowledged. And because he is consistent, she assumes he's unaffected. She mistakes his emotional discipline for emotional invulnerability. But comfort is not neutral. When it replaces appreciation, it slowly teaches one person that their effort is no longer remarkable and teaches the other that their presence is no longer optional. Emotional withdrawal rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with arguments, ultimatums, or dramatic exits. It begins internally long before distance becomes visible. By the time physical absence occurs, the emotional separation has already settled into place, quietly and completely. At first, the man still shows up. He still answers messages, still listens, still participates, but something has shifted beneath the surface. The enthusiasm that once fueled his effort has been replaced by restraint. He is no longer giving from abundance, he is giving from habit, and habits can continue long after emotional connection has started to thin. This withdrawal begins as a protective response, not a punishment. After repeated moments of feeling unseen, unappreciated, or emotionally overlooked, the mind seeks balance. Instead of asking for more, he asks for less from himself. He reduces emotional investment because investing without return teaches vulnerability to feel unsafe. Silence becomes easier than explanation. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this phase is its calmness. There is no anger, no desperation, no urgency. He doesn't chase validation or demand reassurance. From the outside, it looks like maturity or emotional stability. From the inside, it is disengagement. He has stopped hoping for change and started preparing for independence. He no longer brings up concerns because past experiences taught him that expressing needs didn't lead to meaningful shifts. So he adapts instead. He becomes more self-contained, more inwardly focused. He shares less, not because he has nothing to say, but because he no longer feels the need to be understood in the same way. This internal retreat often goes unnoticed because he continues fulfilling his role. Responsibilities are met, commitments are honored. He doesn't become unreliable or distant in obvious ways. That consistency masks the emotional loss happening underneath. She sees presence and assumes connection, unaware that one can exist without the other. Over time, emotional withdrawal reshapes priorities. He invests energy elsewhere, into work, routines, personal growth, solitude, not as an escape, but as a reallocation. The emotional space that once belonged to the relationship is now guarded. He is no longer emotionally available in the same way because availability without reciprocity taught him depletion. This stage is especially dangerous because it removes emotional signals. There are fewer conflicts, fewer difficult conversations, fewer emotional reactions. The relationship feels smooth, but smoothness here is not health, it is detachment. Problems stop surfacing, not because they've been resolved, but because they no longer feel worth addressing. When physical distance finally appears, less time together, fewer initiations, eventual separation, it feels sudden to her. She experiences it as an unexpected shift, a shock. What she doesn't realize is that she is reacting to the final step of a process that began long ago. The emotional exit was completed quietly, long before the physical one began. The most painful part of emotional withdrawal is its invisibility. By the time she notices something is wrong, the bond has already weakened beyond easy repair. He is no longer reaching for closeness because he has learned to survive without it. And survival, once mastered, rarely seeks what once felt necessary. Emotional withdrawal is not an act of abandonment. It is the slow consequence of feeling emotionally alone while still being present. Missing someone does not begin at the moment they walk away. It begins the moment access to them is no longer guaranteed. Love can exist without urgency as long as presence is assumed, but the instant that assumption breaks, the mind is forced to reevaluate what it once overlooked. When a man is consistently available, his presence blends into daily life. Messages arrive when expected. Calls are answered. Support is given without negotiation. Because access is stable, it feels infinite. And what feels infinite rarely triggers emotional alarm. The brain does not register loss until it senses restriction. As long as he is reachable, the emotional system remains relaxed, even if appreciation has faded. The shift happens when access changes. Not necessarily through disappearance, but through limitation. He responds less quickly. He shares less of his inner world. He becomes selective with his time and energy. These changes disrupt the psychological safety net she unconsciously relied on. Suddenly, his presence feels conditional, and conditional access forces awareness. At this stage, memory becomes active. The mind starts replaying moments that once felt ordinary. His patience, his emotional steadiness, his reliability in moments that mattered. These memories surface not because love suddenly increased, but because the risk of losing access sharpens perception. The brain magnifies value only after it senses scarcity. What's often misunderstood is that missing is not proof of emotional depth. It is proof of emotional contrast. When someone is always there, the nervous system adapts. When they are no longer available in the same way, the nervous system reacts. The longing she feels is tied less to affection and more to the disruption of expectation. Access creates emotional convenience. Loss of access creates emotional awareness. She begins to notice the silence where his presence used to live. The absence is not dramatic, but it is persistent. There's no conflict to blame, no clear mistake to point to. Just a quiet gap that refuses to be ignored. And in that gap, the realization forms he was not just present, he was grounding. He provided emotional structure she didn't consciously recognize while it was intact. This realization is often delayed because the mind resists accountability. It's easier to miss someone than to confront how their value was minimized. Missing allows emotion without responsibility. It focuses on what is lost rather than how it was lost. And so the longing grows while understanding lags behind. Another crucial element is this: access feels like entitlement until it's removed. She didn't see his presence as a choice because he never framed it as one. He didn't threaten to leave. He didn't withdraw dramatically. He simply stopped offering himself freely. And that quiet withdrawal reframed everything. When she realizes that his presence was voluntary, not guaranteed, the emotional impact intensifies. The certainty she once had collapses, replaced by questions. Would he still show up if she reached out? Would he still care in the same way? The unknown creates emotional weight that certainty never could. Missing, in this sense, is not about love returning. It's about reality arriving. It's the moment when emotional access is no longer unlimited, and the mind finally understands the cost of taking something for granted. In the end, the pain is not caused by his absence alone, but by the awareness that arrives too late. What was once steady is now distant. What was once available is now selective. And in that shift, understanding replaces assumption. Taking someone for granted is rarely intentional. It grows quietly through comfort, predictability, and the belief that certain people will always remain. But no presence is permanent when it is no longer valued. Consistency without appreciation teaches loss before it teaches regret. Missing him becomes a lesson, not a punishment. A lesson in how access hides value, how silence can carry meaning, and how emotional security should never be confused with emotional permanence. By the time clarity arrives, the space he once filled is already guarded by distance, by self-respect, and by the understanding that being chosen matters more than being expected. And that is the truth most people only learn when presence becomes memory.